This video will describe how to create a new form. To create a new form, you click on File and New and Form, and we're going to come back to the Easy Form Design Wizard later. We're not going to use it right now. We're going to create a form from scratch, and so we're going to say no here to the wizard. And when you do that, it brings up the Form Properties window, and if you have any of the form properties you'd like to change, you can do that here, although generally these settings are the standard settings and it's best to just leave them the way they are. So you can click OK here. The software will bring up the workspace. The workspace is a grid of dots where bubbles might land, and it's just giving you a grid to work by. The gray line over here is the right side of the page, and if I scroll down, the gray line at the bottom is the bottom of the page. And all of this other space is working space that you may need during the course of designing a form. To create a form, you begin just using the drawing tools, adding different bits and pieces to your form. The tools are up here on the Tools menu. You will spend about 80% of your time working from the Tools menu. There are these standard tools for Form ID, responses or bubbles, text, line, boxes, shading, and graphics, and then there are a number of special tools for doing different things. The way the software works is you select one of the tools. Let's say we wanted to put a title. We come down here, and when we move our cursor down onto the workspace, when we're ready to draw something, our cursor will change to a crosshair cursor to let you know that you're ready to draw something. You can then left click and drag a little box, drag down and to the right, and the software will put something on the form. What happens with a text field is it puts ABC because we haven't entered anything, but we can do that here on the Field Properties window. We can change any of the characteristics here. We could change the color, the font name, the font size, whether the field was horizontal and its text alignment, and we can enter the text we would like to have here. So I'm going to press caps lock, and we're going to enter a title text. This is my title for my new form. And when we click OK, well, let's change the size a little bit. Titles we like to be a bit bigger, so I'm going to change this to 20. I'm going to select that, press 2 to change it to 20, and I'm going to make it bold just to make it a little bit bigger. And when I click OK here, I then get the changes that I just entered. Now, once something is on the form, it can be modified and moved very easily. To move any item, you put your cursor over it, and when you see this 4-point cursor, this is a standard move cursor. You click on the left mouse button and drag it to wherever you want it to be, and you can move it as many times as you need to. So it's very easy to move things around. Any of the properties that you want to change are up here on the object bar. These are exactly the same properties that you saw in that Field Properties window just a minute ago. You can always get back to that nicely labeled Field Properties window by clicking on the Properties button here, or by double-clicking on the field, and it will bring up the same properties. These properties and the ones on the object bar are exactly the same properties. They're just presented a little bit differently. Sometimes it's easier to change the properties here. Let's say I wanted to make this slightly bigger. I can make it slightly bigger by changing the point size. Okay, so with any of the drawing tools, and the drawing tools are also right here on the object bar, on the toolbar, in the exact same order that they appear on the Tools menu. So there is Form ID, Response, Text, Line, Box, Shade, and Graphic. They're the same things here: Form ID, Response, Text, Line, Box, Shade, and Graphic. So I can click on a tool here, and when you click on a tool to draw something, it's always left click and drag, and it will draw this, in this case, a line. I can then change the properties on my Field Properties window that comes up. So if I wanted to make that line bigger, I can do that here. Now with lines, boxes, and shading, you can modify the size of the object by moving your cursor over one of these little squares on the end. We call these squares handles or field markers, and when you get the two-pointed cursor, this is a sizing cursor. If I click on the left mouse button and drag, it will drag the item. It will make the item bigger if I drag it to the right. If I drag it to the left, it will make the item smaller. With a line, you only have one dimension, so it's either bigger or smaller, left or right. You can also draw vertical lines by just simply dragging down, and you get a vertical line. So with a box, I'm going to click on the box tool here. It's the same thing. Move your cursor onto the workspace, left click and drag, and it will make a box. Notice that the characteristics of the box match the last line that I drew. That's very much on purpose, so that if you're doing objects that are very similar, the next object you draw is very similar to the last object. But I can change that if I wanted to. I could make it the line width thinner. With a box, you can round the corners to make it look different, and this is simply just an aesthetic look. And so you can, once again, change the characteristics at any time. You can also move this object by left-clicking on it and dragging it around anywhere on the workspace. You can even move it off the workspace if you need to get it out of the way for a little while, and then you can simply bring it back onto your form later. So that's a box. If I want to draw a piece of shade somewhere, I can left-click and drag. It's just like a box, but with a shading object. Really the only two properties are the color and the corner type, and I can round the corners of shade as well. The reason it comes up with 5% gray is because most shading objects are very light. They're meant to shade certain things. When you run shade across the bubble or circle areas that are supposed to pick up data, you need to keep them very light, and 5% is a really good percentage for those shades. And the reason is so that the shading won't interfere with the scanning of the bubbles or circles. So we'll click OK here. And then to create, so we've created text, line, box, and shade. We can create bubbles or circles or responses as we call them, and we click on the response tool. And notice that it pops up a font called Circle Normal. There are several sizes of circles, ovals, and squares that you can use. We usually recommend that you stick to circles and ovals because people tend to fill those out more completely. Squares are not usually filled out as well. So I'm just going to leave it selected as Circle Normal. Over here, I can select what I want in my bubbles. If I want a 0 through 9 grid to pick up a number, like a course ID or a student ID or some sort of ID number or even a date, I can click here on 0 through 9. I'm going to change it here to vertical. This is the object orientation, horizontal or vertical. And when I come down here, I left click and drag, exactly the same as all the other objects. When you're putting an object on the form, it's always move your cursor onto the workspace, click and hold the left mouse button, and drag down and to the right, and the software will put something on the form that you can then move around and modify. Now, because bubbles are a scannable element, the names you give these elements are going to appear later when you go to scan the data. So it's a good idea to give this a name. So if this was a student ID, I would give it a name. Now you can give every field a name, but the most important ones are the scannable elements, and the responses are one of those scannable elements. So when I click OK here, it just gave it a name. We didn't really change anything, but now I have a grid with 0, 1, 2, 3 all the way through 9 down here, and I can pick up a 6-digit number with this field. Okay, and so this is the way you work the software at its most basic level. Now, with a field like this, you can build boxes around it. You can put a title above it, and you can do that with the boxes. And we'll do that real quickly. I want to show you one of the special tools when you're using a bubble field like this. Drawing little boxes above the field so that the person can write in the character before they fill in the bubble makes it easier to read for people. It also makes it people tend to fill in the bubble, the correct bubble, more accurately if they've written the character first. Those little boxes are a little tedious to make, so we have a tool, special tool, on the Tools menu called Box Responses. So when I select that, click off in the white space to unselect everything, this is what it does. It draws these little boxes for you. Now, with the bubble area, notice that there's this gray crosshatch area. It's very light. It's a little hard to see, but that area does not print. With this software, there is a little there is a little area around each of the bubbles that you are not supposed to go in. So it's called a stay out of area. So you wouldn't want to do something like this. I'm going to click on my box tool, and I'm going to draw a box right next to the bubbles. Okay, this is a no-no. And the reason is because when you put things this close to the bubbles, it interferes with the scanning program's ability to scan this area. So at the very worst, you would, and I'm going to make this bigger at both ends, I would put it on the edge of this gray crosshatch area. Okay, but I'm going to expand this a little, and I'm going to add a title. Student ID, and when I put it on the form, once again, it used the last text object, and that was my title. That's why it's so big. We're actually going to make this smaller. I'm just going to type in 10, and we'll make it regular. And when I click OK, it'll modify it, and then I can move it over a little bit to center it. Move it back just a little bit. Okay. So this is a way to build a field, and you can also put shading on every other column. This helps people fill out the bubble field more correctly. I click OK. I'm going to make this one a little bit bigger here. We have also another very, very handy feature, and I'm going to illustrate that right now. If you have an object selected, press the Control key, move your cursor over that object, click on the left mouse button, hold it down, and drag over, and it will drag an exact copy. So we now have a second piece of shade exactly like the first one. And I'm going to do that one more time. Hold down the Control key, left click, drag, and I get an exact copy. Okay. This helps the person who's filling out the form to accurately fill in the correct character in the correct bubble. Okay. Now that control, I'm going to select all of these by holding down my mouse button, left mouse button, and dragging a little box over. This selects all the fields that we just created. Using that Control copy method, I can hold down the Control key, left click, and drag an entire copy of everything. So whatever is selected, no matter how few or how many fields are selected, when you use Control copy, it makes an exact copy of those objects. So I'm going to delete this by going up here. I just wanted to do that for illustration. I'm going to click on this big X here. That means delete selected fields, and I'm going to click on that. Now, these fields, there was a little bit of work involved in making this field, so there's a special tool to help you build fields like that very quickly and easily. If you go to Tools and Predefined Fields, software will bring up a list of these predefined fields that it will build for you automatically, and you can tell it where to put that field down here. So I'm going to tell it I want to put it on about row, let's say row 18. Field column 4 is correct. I do want a 0 through 9 grid because that's what this is. I don't want this. Here are the 0 through 9 grid properties that I can modify. I don't want 10 columns. I only want 6. Whoops, went the wrong way. And then I'm going to change my header text to student ID. And then when I click OK, this is what happens. It builds this nice field for me automatically, has a box around it, puts in the heading that I typed, the little boxes, the shading, and the 0 through 9 grid. So that saved me a lot of work. So that's another tool that's very handy. And just to illustrate a little bit here, we have an A through Z grid. This is meant for something like a name, and down here you can change some of the properties of the A through Z grid. There's 3 different sizes of dates: a 2-year a 2-digit year, a 4-digit year, and a very fancy date. And then there's this fill in the circles completely box, and there are some properties down here that you can add. This is a box that tells people how to fill in the bubbles. It tells them to fill them in solidly, don't X them. You can't see the whole box over here, but if you created one, you would see some of the incorrect bubbles, and you can add a piece of text that says use pen or pencil, or you can add a use number 2 pencil graphic. And you can select the size. So these are what the predefined fields do. They're just work savers. Okay, so I'm going to select all this, and I'm going to delete it. But once again, the most important thing to learn here is that when you're drawing something, if you click on an object or double click on it, it will bring up the properties that you can change. You can also change the size of some objects by dragging the handles. Okay, and you can also move things around very easily. Those are the main things to see in this section. I'm going to save it as just a name. I save my test files in a file called atest.